Here we go. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. This is my dear friend, Anya Foxen. She's an associate professor of religious studies at California Polytechnic State University, St. Louis Obispo. She's also headed to Harvard Divinity School this fall as a visiting associate professor. So we're really excited about that. She received her Ph.D. from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on the intersection of South Asian yogic and tantric traditions within Western esotericism and metaphysical spiritualities. Her special areas of interest include gender and embodiment, as well as the interplay of religion and science. She has 3 books published in lots and lots and lots of papers and book chapters. Her first book was published in 2017, Biography of a Yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda and the Origins of Modern Yoga. Her second book was published in 2020, Inhaling Spirit, Harmonialism, Orientalism, and the Western Roots of Modern Yoga. Her third book in 2021 is This Yoga, Concepts, Histories, and Complexities of Modern Practice. This was co-edited with co-written with Krista Kuberi. And the title of her talk today is This Yoga? History, Translation, and the Problem with Appendicity. So we've already lost 10 minutes. I'm going to give it to you. And again, if you're a yoga class, this is your sheet. Just put your name in there. If you're my intro to religious studies class, Ashlyn is your person. She'll have to figure it out. So.
Amazing. Thank you, Shravana. Talk like really fast, I guess. Okay, so first let me issue a couple of disclaimers. You'll notice that the key words in this talk's title are history and authenticity. So let me just clarify that I'm not here to tell you where yoga definitively comes from, or what does and does not count as authentic yoga. I'm not even going to conclusively tell you whether anything is or isn't yoga. Sorry, I know that might be kind of a disappointment. But this is really because from a historical perspective, these questions don't have hard and fast answers. They're really, really complicated questions. And they're especially complicated in our modern global context. We're talking about origins and authenticity kind of inevitably means that we have to talk about colonialism and issues of power dynamics and social justice and things like that. So what I'd like for us to think about as we're trying to wrap our heads around the story of modern yoga isn't just the objective historical facts of how certain ideas or practices got to be the way that they are today, but why some folks might be invested in labeling things one way or another. We could say that yoga is very much in the eye of the beholder, but then every beholder has their own special interests and their agendas and stuff like that. So first, show of hands. How many of you have ever done a yoga class? Like, doesn't matter what kind, just anything. Okay, cool. And for how many of you did doing that yoga class mostly entail poses? So like lunges and stretches and stuff. Okay, so like not everyone, but like mostly, right? So here's where we can start. If you've hung around like serious yoga people at all, you might have heard that real yoga isn't just physical poses. That yoga isn't synonymous with what we call asana or posture. But let's think about what we're actually saying there. Like, is there even such a thing as just doing a pose? Let me give you an example. So this is a yoga pose, right? That's downward facing dog. This is also a pose, but is this yoga? Well, what makes one pose different from the other? What I'm trying to get at is that we're never just doing things with our bodies. At the very least, we're always doing them for a reason. So here's the tricky thing then. Right? This is yoga. That's BKS Iyengar doing Virabhadrasana in Light of Yoga, which was one of his kind of famous classic books. But is this yoga? They're kind of the same pose, right? And I can even tell you that the pose on the right is supposed to also be performed in tandem with breath work. So it has that kind of complexity to it. But I can also tell you with reasonable certainty that Mary Bissell, who is the author of this book on women's fitness from 1891, had never heard of yoga. Or if she had, that's not what she would have said her book was about. technically the thing on the right is not an asana. It doesn't come from India, and historically has very little, if anything, to do with stuff that would have been called yoga at the time. Now, what do I mean when I say historically? What I'm saying is that the practice that Mary Bissell was advocating in 1891 evolved more or less independently from any kind of preceding Indian yoga tradition. And we know this because texts are sort of nice this way, right? They'll kind of use words to represent concepts, and mostly we can sort of trace those words back somewhere. Sometimes the author might even tell us where they're getting a particular concept from. So that's why we can say that Mary Bissell is not talking about yoga, and the concepts and practices that she's talking about don't come from yogic sources. They come from somewhere else. So when we say that yoga isn't just about poses, what do we really mean by that then? Usually we point to the philosophy behind it, and this kind of idea that yoga is a holistic practice or it's a lifestyle. And that's all very important. But what I want to maybe do to reframe the question for us a little bit is to say that I often think we're dismissive of yoga as a physical practice because we have this kind of reflexive assumption that if something is happening to the body, it's somehow less profound than, I don't know, meditation, right? Which, by the way, we don't ever meditate without using our bodies, right? And there's lots of traditional styles of meditation that don't involve just sitting still. They actually involve movement. Or maybe it's less important or complicated than ethics or philosophy or something like that. So let's just agree to drop that notion for the remainder of our time here today. Bodily practices are also really meaningful and really complicated. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all of these ambiguities when it comes to figuring out what these images are that I'm depicting for us here. So we could say that what's at stake in whether something is or isn't yoga is why we move the body in a particular way. What is putting the body in one pose or another, moving it in this way or that other way, supposed to be doing, right? Why? For what? What do you think is going on inside your body when you do this thing? What are you trying to accomplish? What's the goal of the practice? Let's go back to these two images on the screen here. B.K.S. Iyengar, if you asked him, would have had all sorts of reasons for why moving his body in this way counts as yoga. So this is yoga over on the left, right? We can at least kind of contingently say. But Mary Bissell over on the right there has never heard of yoga. So she wouldn't explain what she's doing in those terms at all. So here's the catch now. Historically, the stuff that you'll do at your average yoga studio or gym yoga class or whatever in the US is much more related to what's going on with Mary Bissell than what's going on with Iyengar. And if you really want to blow your mind, there are also significant ways that Iyengar himself was very much influenced by Western teachers like Bissell, even though obviously a lot of what he's doing is also grounded in Indian traditions and bodily practices. So here's my point in a nutshell for today. Modern yoga is a hybrid practice that consists of these two different cultural traditions. There are good reasons why we can't look at ancient Indian texts and find in them the kind of practice that you'll find in today's American yoga studios. Now, one of those reasons is that today's practice is today's practice. It's modern, it's not ancient. So very few things look today like they would have looked 3,000 years ago, right? That's just like kind of how modernity and history work. But the other reason is that today's form of yoga practice is not entirely Indian. Depending on what studio you go to, I would argue that actually it's not even primarily Indian, it's Western. So how did we come to call it yoga? Well, some of it actually goes back to early modern Indian teachers of yoga, like Iyengar, but Iyengar is actually pretty late to the game here. Here I'm talking about guys who really were a generation or two before him even. They made this link between these two traditions. And so did the Western students that they were teaching to. So let me give you another metaphor, because we're talking about cultures and transmission and translation and things like that, and it can very quickly get, I think, super abstract. So this is a lotus. Now, imagine that you've never seen a lotus before, but guess what you have seen? A water lily. Now, you might look at the lotus and go, okay, so it's basically a water lily, right? They look really similar. And then you'd make all sorts of assumptions about the lotus based on that knowledge that you have about the water lily, and you'd probably treat it essentially like a water lily. You'd probably plant it in your water lily pond, and then it would grow with the lotuses and the water lilies, and they'd get all tangled up together. And actually, nobody really would be able to tell the difference after a while, unless they really were, a botanist or something like that, right? It would be this sort of like mishmash of stuff. So imagine now that you're the one bringing the lotus to a place where no one has ever seen or heard of such a thing before. But again, they've got the water lilies, right? So you might say something like, hey, look, it's kind of like a water lily. But guess what? It's even better, right? Because you're trying to sell them this thing. And let's say that your audience believes you, because we all like exotic new things, right? But since they don't actually understand the difference between a lotus and a water lily anyway, they're just going to start calling all the flowers in this pond lotuses, because that sounds even cooler. But chances are, given that you planted your lotus in a pond full of water lilies, even if the lotus had kind of had time to spread and multiply and stuff like that and weave itself into the mix, most of those flowers are still water lilies. So the story of modern yoga is basically one big lotus water lily exchange program. Imagine two ponds. One is a lotus pond where some water lilies have been planted. This is India. The other pond is a water lily pond where some imported lotuses have been sort of planted into the mix. This is the United States and really all of North America and Europe more broadly. Except we've kind of forgotten that the water lilies were even a thing at all. And so we're calling everything lotuses now. We're calling everything yoga. Now, obviously cultural traditions are not actually plants. Things are a lot more complicated, so the metaphor only goes so far. But what I want to spend the rest of my time here today doing is showing you why this cultural transmission happened. Why a century and a half ago, both Indian teachers and Western practitioners decided that what they were doing was similar enough that they could kind of slap a single term on it and just call it good. And also why this is a little bit misleading maybe, right? Because actually it prevents us from seeing and understanding how there is more than one kind of historically, quote unquote, authentic practice going on. So let's rewind a bit. We were talking about bodily practices, including breathing and moving the body and putting it into certain shapes. And we were talking about how looking at what the body is doing on the outside is not enough. How we need to ask why we're doing these things with the body. What do we think is happening on the inside? What we're trying to accomplish. Well, if you ask your yoga teacher about this, she might start talking to you about energy and maybe even about these things called chakras. So here's where our first crucial point of similarity between what's going on in pre-modern yoga traditions and what's going on in pre-modern Western traditions comes around. And so I'm calling these Western traditions harmonial traditions for reasons that I'll say a little bit about in a second here. Ultimately, both the Indian and the Western sides of these bodily practices are rooted in religion, or at least in what we might kind of more generally call spirituality these days, right? It's often not sort of institutionalized the way that we think of religion being so. And so what we effectively see in both places is a history of traditions of mapping the cosmos, so the universe, and its divine forces especially, onto the human body. Meaning these are essentially mystical practices where the body is understood to be interconnected to the universe at large. In fact, the body is understood to be a kind of miniature version of the universe, what we call a microcosm. And so systematically moving our awareness through the body, effectively manipulating the energies within the body, could send us on this kind of cosmic journey into like a higher state of being, right? And as a feature of that, it could make our body better and more perfect, right? Just even on the level of the physical body. In the Indian context, so what you see over on the left there, the chakras are definitely one aspect of this idea. Chakras are basically circles of deities, usually goddesses, and they're visualized at important centers within the body. Now, in the West, this model has been astrological, so that's what you're looking at on the right over there, at least one example of it. So the body's major centers are associated with the various planets. Now, Here it's worth noting that in the original version of this, which goes all the way back to ancient Greece, the planets are also deities. It's just that we don't really talk about them that way anymore because this model gets integrated with Christianity, and then you can't really be talking about kind of random deities floating around everywhere, right? Like just God is God. But in both cases, this is basically a way of imagining the body as a kind of, as this microcosm, this little world onto itself that's entangled with these larger divine cosmic energies. So in the Indian case, the way that this normally works is that you use these energies within the body to kind of transform the body from the inside. One really common model of this is what's called Kundalini awakening, where the basic idea is that there's this primordial divine energy that underlies the entire cosmos. And it's resting dormant somewhere in the body. Often it's kind of lower in the body, in the abdomen, or maybe at the base of the spine. And so the goal is to awaken this energy and to channel it up through the various chakras, which is what you see kind of pictured vertically through the body here. This is what the various physical exercises are for by the time that you get to medieval yoga traditions, and all this stuff kind of gets integrated and bundled together. The physical exercises work along with breath work and meditation to control this internal energy, and again, to basically transform and rebuild the body from the inside out. In the West, it actually is kind of the opposite. The cosmic reservoir of energy is the universe itself. And so what you do is to bring this energy into the body and to establish this sort of, this actually isn't Western, let's go a little bit further here, back to that other slide. What you do in the Western example is to kind of establish this equilibrium with the cosmic order. So you can sort of see this kind of spiral pattern going around the various planets of the universe. And especially what you want to accomplish here is to bring the whole system into harmony, right? Both within or between the various parts of the body, and also between the body and the whole universe at large. So this is actually the key difference between these two systems. This is why your yoga teacher might tell you that what you need to do is to balance your chakras, which isn't really a thing in the Indian traditions. You don't balance your chakras, maybe pierce them or something like that. In other words, when your yoga teacher says that, she's talking about her water lily, but she's calling it a lotus, right? She's talking about this Western tradition, but she's using basically Indian terminology for it. So one thing that I want to kind of push back against here is this idea that within modern yoga, the Indian components of it are kind of traditional and spiritual, whereas the Western components are modern and secular. As I already said, of course, modern yoga is modern. Right? It's modern here. It's also modern in India. Right? India doesn't get an exception from modernity. That's not how the world works. And so, yes, that means that everywhere, right, in the entirety of this global context, it's understood in these more modern, biological, psychological terms. And yes, the yoga that you'll find at the gym is more secular. But again, this is true of all sorts of things, including what we now call biology and psychology. If we trace those things back to their pre-modern origins, we'll see that they're also loaded with all sorts of spiritual assumptions. For example, a lot of pre-modern Western medicine is actually astrological, just like this system here is. So let me show you what I mean by that, actually. This is a medical diagram from the 17th century, so actually not that long ago from Europe. What we see here is a map of the human body according to the planets and the signs of the zodiac. The lists that you see here are various ailments, kind of going from the inside out, and then the specific body parts and organs that they're associated with, and then the various herbs that can be used to treat them. So it's sort of a very practical chart. It's almost like a reference point. Here are another couple of images that are roughly from the same time period, so we're talking still about the 17th century. These are actually from a book on cosmology by a 17th century English physician named Robert Flood. So he's a doctor, but back then doctors kind of did all sorts of stuff, right? Like you multitask a lot. And so here what you see are two sort of different but complementary versions of talking about the body in European culture. Both of them rely on the same kind of analogy that we've already talked about that's also really common in the various Indian yogic systems. And so what's going on here is this kind of microcosm, macrocosm thing, right? We just saw that in the more medically targeted image as well. The idea is that the human body is sort of a universe in miniature, and that the human body and the universe, the microcosm and the macrocosm, are connected via this series of correspondences. So there's these sort of links, right, that analogize one thing to the other. Things that happen out there are reflected in here within the body, and vice versa. Now, again, on the left, what you see is the human body once more, or sorry, on the right, where you have this sort of close-up of the torso. But here it's broken up a little bit different. In both cases, we're working with, since it's the 17th century, still sort of a geocentric version of the cosmos, right? So if you kind of go over to the left-hand image, the Earth actually isn't even pictured, but it would be this thing in the middle. And then all the planets, including the sun, are essentially revolving around the Earth, like we used to think it worked. Same thing here. The terrestrial sphere, the earthly sphere, is associated with the sort of lower portion of the body. Here you have this intestinal fire that's analogized with the element of fire out there in the universe. The sun is normally correlated with the heart, but also this region of the solar plexus, which by the way is why it's called a solar plexus. It goes back to kind of this period. And so this is the, whereas this is the terrestrial realm, this next segment of the body, the kind of chest area, is associated with what we call the ethereal or the astral realm. So this is now understood to be no longer purely physical. There's like spiritual relevance to this dimension. And then the highest area is in the head. This is what would have been known as kind of the intellectual or the rational capacities of the soul. And then beyond that is God, because we're dealing with Christianity again. And so what's really interesting about these two systems is that the first one of these is actually organized according to very specific proportions. They're musical proportions. If you kind of look closely, that's actually how this whole thing is described. You have this chord, this sort of musical string effectively, going down vertically, the whole image, and then the proportions of this are the proportions of the diatonic octave. And so you have these musical notes, and the way that the musical notes are spaced out, that are understood to be sort of similar to the way that these cosmic energies correspond to the various areas of the body. So this is why I call this Western system harmonialism, actually, because that's the harmony, right? It's the harmony of all these various centers and all these various notes within the body. On the right, once again, it's a little bit simpler, right? And this is actually something that goes back to before Christianity, right? This whole kind of the vegetative, the spirited, and then the rational capacities of the soul go back to ancient Greece. But within Christianity, this is also often associated with like the Christian Trinity and stuff like that. So one way that all of this shows up in practical terms is through this idea that the way that we elevate both the body and our soul to a higher state is by literally drawing on the power of cosmic spirit. And this is where, once again, harmony becomes really important, because the mechanism for all of this is a kind of resonance. It's like an amplification, you know, if you're talking about it in terms of sound waves. Using these correspondences between the human body and the celestial bodies allows you to call on the energies, right, the divine energies of those powers within the cosmos. And so especially important is this link between the sun and the heart. But if we're talking about this in a medical sense, actually all of the planets become important, right? So if there's something wrong with, you know, your liver, let's say, you'll want to kind of call upon the energies, including like using the herbs and stuff that are associated with your liver. And so all of this would have sort of been organized according to these astrological, cosmological types of systems. And so the way that we ultimately then maximize the influx of our energies, that's really the key here, right? Creating balance, creating this harmony is to call upon all these links at every level. Music does continue to be really important here as well. So like if we're talking about music in yoga classes, there actually is this sort of interesting precedent for that. In fact, you have all these texts saying that music is really the closest thing to spirit from a kind of, again, like a cosmic sense. It's the thing that acts in the most similar way. And so the origins of a lot of these sort of formalized movement practices that we're familiar with today actually are owed to this framework. Ballet originates here. When you're doing ballet, the way that they would sort of choreograph their dances is to essentially move the way that the celestial bodies are supposed to move, right? And again, the harmony and the kind of proportions of the way that the body is organized. Here's one example of that I really like. This is a quote from an Italian Renaissance. Basically, he's a wizard, right? I mean, we could come up with like less exciting words for him, but that is what this dude is. His name is Marsilio Ficino. And Ficino says in these books that are essentially dealing with Renaissance medicine, he advises us to exercise by keeping the body constantly in motion and to make various circular movements like those of the heavenly bodies. Why? Well, since by their movings and circlings you were engendered, Ficino says, by making similar motions you will be preserved, right? Because these are basically the origin of like the way that our body is put together. This is the cosmic order that, in this case, God created. By imitating this order, by kind of reinscribing this order back into the body, you're gonna make your body be its best self. Now, this idea really sticks, actually, as we move forward in history. Scholars of the history of yoga have pointed out that as we get into the colonial period in India, innovators of yoga traditions there begin drawing on European forms of gymnastics, which come to them in all sorts of ways, by way of British military calisthenics, but also just books on European physical culture in general. And so these ideas actually do, from not maybe fairly early, right, but at least the 18th, 19th century onwards, begin to be absorbed and like sort of hybridized with Indian traditions as well. And if we want to see one example of this sort of more modern version that would have entered into this conversation, here we can look at this physical system by a doctor, and actually he did all sorts of things. He was also a poet, a Swedish doctor named Per-Heinrich Ling. So this is actually the cover from the one book that he ever published, where he sort of lays out his physical system. And then this image on the right here is from one of the many, many books that were published across Europe and within the US that were essentially kind of adapting his system and popularizing it through these manuals that you could just buy at a bookstore. Now, Ling didn't invent European physical culture or the idea of exercise in general, whether it's therapeutic or anything else. You can find this link between exercise and health and spirituality going all the way back to, again, ancient Greek medicine, basically. You can see this in Galen. Really, that never went away. We often talk about there being this kind of revival of physical culture in the 19th century, but it's more of the way that it's being modernized, right, is that kind of revival, is being popularized, is being offered to people on a scale that it wouldn't have been before, rather than that we're actually seeing something that's genuinely new. And so what's important about Ling is that even though he didn't invent these systems, even though he didn't necessarily invent these exercises, he systematized them in a really important way. So he's a sort of conduit for all this stuff making its way out into the general public. And he was definitely embedded in all of these various harmonial ideas that we've just been talking about, these correspondences between the way that the body works and the way that the universe at large works. He's very into this notion of the three layers specifically. He talks about, for example, the dynamic phenomena of the mental and the moral faculties, which are associated kind of for him with, these more cognitive things. Then he talks about the chemical phenomena of the body's internal processes, which is how this sort of spiritual dimension is becoming understood. And then he also talks about kind of the mechanical dynamics of the body, which is where the motion comes in. And so you notice there's a lot of still this kind of like rotating, right, in a very specific way. So one thing that you would do in Ling is like you would just like kind of like wave your arm around in various fashions. So it's kind of this updating, right, of the basic triad of body, spirit, and mind, which has all these parallels going all the way back. And according to Ling, which here he's very much in following tradition, this sort of unified harmony of these three principles of the human being, not just the body, but the whole human being, is how we attain this holistic state of health and well-being. It's physical culture, or it's basically exercise in more modern terms. But he understands it as the soul acting on the body and the body acting on the soul. There's this kind of sort of metaphysical back and forth to it. And so if you look at these exercise manuals that come out of Ling's system, a lot of these movements and positions are actually exactly the sort of thing that you would do in a modern yoga class, right? This is what we would call, maybe the top image there, going into like what we would call camel pose these days, where you essentially do a back bend on your knees, and then on the lower part of the screen there, this guy is doing forearm plank, right? We could give these things Sanskrit names, but that's not what Ling would have called them. So the question here then remains, how does this become actually called yoga, right? And so here we can actually go back to these images that we saw at the beginning of today's talk. This is a system that is coming from a similar place to the images on the previous slide, but it's specifically for women. And so actually, in order to answer the question of how did this come to be called yoga, the other question that comes up that we haven't really addressed yet is why yoga came to be something that primarily women practice. If you look at the surveys of yoga demographics in the US over the last decade and a half or so, when these numbers have been collected, somewhere between 75 and 85% of yoga practitioners identify as women. So it's not a small discrepancy, right, between the demographics. Well, this is unusual, in fact, right? If you look at both of the kind of cultural contributors to this practice, because both in India and the West, these were traditionally practices for men, right? Medieval yogic texts assumed the male body by default. Physical culture was something that men were supposed to do, right? Especially in the 19th century. This gets very iffy because this is kind of the height of the separation of the spheres. Women are not supposed to be going out and kind of running around, right? So what we need to talk about then, if we're going to understand how this transition took place, is actually another system of European physical culture, which had a lot of in common with Ling, but which ended up being practiced mostly by women. This is a system called Delsarte, which I like to actually call the first lifestyle brand. And the reason that I do that is because of images like this one on the screen here in particular. Today, women wear yoga pants, right, which are basically branded leggings. Back then, women wore Delsarte corsets. So it was this like kind of holistic, right, like genuinely a lifestyle brand that was supposed to get you to be the kind of person that, you know, we should all aspire to be. And like Ling's system, Delsarte was always at least implicitly spiritual, even though it had obviously these kind of modern consumeristic, like capitalist, right, neoliberal maybe trappings. So basically the idea here again is that we can use this framework, this system of exercise, to harmonize our whole system, creating this balance between the different elements of the body, really balancing mind, body, and spirit. And by doing this, we can allow the body to most fully express the soul. It's a fundamentally spiritual thing to do with your body, right? That's how well-being is ultimately understood. So, oops, I'm actually gonna skip these. This is like if we had extra time. The thing is, when Indian popularizers of yoga come west to spread their teachings, they catch on to this very same link. Right, this kind of analogy between these two systems that we've just been talking about. How these are essentially ways of manipulating the energies within the body to affect something on both a physical and a spiritual level. Oh my gosh, I don't know what it just did there. Okay, let's go back to Vivekananda. He's very important. So when popularizers of yoga come west, they go to great pains to translate their teachings into a language that their audiences can understand. But what they also want to do is they want to differentiate their systems that they're bringing over from what's already out there. So for example, Swami Vivekananda, who you see on the screen here, who's often credited with kind of single-handedly popularizing Hinduism and yoga in North America, after his appearance at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, says the following about sort of a competing type of yoga tradition. We have nothing to do with it, right? With, he's talking about Hatha Yoga there in this talk, in this text, because its practices are very difficult and cannot be learned in a day. And after all, they don't lead to much spiritual growth. Many of those practices you will find in Delsarte and other teachers, such as placing the body in different postures. The object of these is physical, not psychological. So let's take Vivekananda's dismissal with a grain of salt here, right? I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing with which we started today's talk, right? This dismissal of just doing things with the body. We're never just doing things with the body. Anybody who's familiar with Delsarte would never label it as purely physical, right? I mean, we could sort of go on about this at greater length, but hopefully I've convinced you that at least there's something spiritual always going on here. So if Vivekananda's statement were true, actually he wouldn't even have to make it. The trouble with mistaking his method for Delsarte isn't that they're too different. It's actually that they're too similar. In other words, Vivekananda sees his method as being in direct competition with these sort of Western systems of practice, right? With systems like Delsarte. So this is why Vivekananda ends up borrowing a lot of language from these systems, even though he's kind of outwardly dismissing them, because he needs the language to translate his concepts. And so this is what he ends up doing, and what a lot of the teachers who follow him begin to do. Not only are they translating from one system to another, but they actually begin to blend the two as well, because that often sort of happens, or almost always happens in translation. So we're back to our lotuses and our water lilies here, right? Essentially, we're kind of taking one thing and planting it into a context that's already filled with something very, very similar. And then we begin to see this kind of slippage of concepts, right? And blending and almost kind of confusion. So let me finish here, and then maybe we can all kind of digest this together a little bit, and we can have time for questions, and I can even go back to any portion of this if we need. But let me finish by showing you what this would have looked like in practice. Let's look at two versions of what it means to move the body along with the breath. Here's what one famous teacher of the Delsarte system named Genevieve Stebbins says about what occurs within the body when we sort of practice this particular thing. Deep rhythmic breathing, says Stebbins, combined with a clearly formulated image or idea in the mind, produces a sensitive magnetic condition in the brain and the lungs, which attracts the finer ethereal essences from the atmosphere with every breath, and stores up this essence in the lung cells and brain convolutions in almost the same way that a storage battery stores up electricity from the dynamo or other source of supply, and is held in suspension amid the molecules forming the cellular tissue as a dynamic energy, possessing both mental and magnetic powers, always ready to use whenever required. This is the art of being able to always express the true self, to elevate the soul to its highest aspiration, and the mind to express its highest possible plane of thought. And last but not least, to concentrate the whole of vital energy at a moment's notice to any portion of the body for the immediate execution of the behests of the will. Moving this way is the art of graceful dynamic presentation of self under all possible circumstances, and an increase of life by increasing the capacity for the reception, the storage, and the utilization of vital power. So there's a lot of like kind of Victorian language going on there, right? She's very much a product of her time, and this is like basically Dickens, but about exercise. But if you look closely at what she's talking about, she's telling us exactly this idea of like kind of drawing in the energy from the cosmos into the body, right? Storing it within the body in these various ways. And then because your body becomes this kind of perfectly harmonized instrument, you're able to use it to at least, essentially do whatever you want to do, right? You're being your best self on a kind of daily practical level. But you're also becoming like a better, right? Like more spiritual, more attuned being as a whole. So this is the water lily. But now, here's what Vivekananda says, right? Vivekananda, we just met, and we know that he knows what he's talking about when he says he'll start. This is from his book called Raja Yoga, which he published about 4 years after the book by Stebbins that was where the previous passage came out. So, in the first place, says Vivekananda, when we breathe and move, right? From rhythmical breathing comes a tendency for all the molecules in the body to move in the same direction. When mind changes into will, the nerve currents change into emotions similar to electricity, because the nerves have been proved to show polarity under the actions of electric currents. This shows that when the will is transformed into the nerve currents, it's changed into something like electricity. But when all the motions of the body have become perfectly rhythmical, the body has, as it were, become a giant battery of will. So you see that same exact language of the battery of electricity that he's using. But here's what comes next. This tremendous will is exactly what the yogi wants. This is, therefore, a physiological explanation of the breathing exercise. It tends to bring a rhythmic action to the body, and it helps us through the respiratory center, essentially through the respiratory chakra, right, to control the other centers, the other chakras. The aim of pranayama, the aim of this breathing exercise here, is to rouse the coiled up power in the muladhara, the base of the spine, called the kundalini. So this is what it looks like to describe a lotus by comparing it to a water lily, right? He's describing this Indian system of yoga, right? Kind of like stimulating these various centers within the body to ultimately channel all the energy downwards to arouse this power that's understood to be latent within the body. But the language that he's using is the language that's kind of common in the Western systems of his time. And so you end up seeing this sort of blending, right? You end up seeing this hybridization that's already beginning to occur. And so I think if you really sit with this, you can kind of begin to see why people begin to call the kind of stuff that Stebbins was doing and what Mary Bissell was doing yoga, even though they would never have used those terms themselves. Right? They're compellingly similar enough, and folks like Vivekananda are describing them through such similar language that if you didn't know any better, right, if you weren't like a specialist in the historical evolution of physical culture, you might very well look at the type of thing that Stebbins is advocating and be like, oh yeah, right, it's basically yoga, right? Why would it be anything else? So that's the history. Now, what about the authenticity? Well, that's a question that I think maybe, we can talk about, right, but ultimately, each one of us sort of has to answer for ourselves, right? Because in a sense, labeling thing one word or another, it's not that it's arbitrary, but it's clearly kind of dependent on these various historical forces. And not only is it dependent on historical forces, but the way that, again, those power dynamics that we mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture operate within that context. Vivekananda is an Indian teacher that's talking to an auditorium of Protestants, right? He's coming from a colonized country where he's had to establish his credibility as a teacher by essentially sort of mirroring this language, such that what he's saying is taken to be legitimate. So he's not doing this in a vacuum, right? And there are these various forces that are pressing upon him that go way beyond just him wanting to kind of sell his system to these, white people in Boston. So when we ask the question of, is this yoga, we can't ever be looking exclusively at what's going on within the body. The body might be doing exactly the same thing from an outward kind of perspective, right? So here's 3 examples of what that might look like. But arguably, these 3 people are aiming to do possibly drastically different things by putting their body in this particular pose. And what's interesting, right, is that 2 of these things, the outer 2 images, by today's standards, we would probably call yoga, even though we might sort of offer certain qualifications. But the image on the left has much more to do with the image in the center. than with the image on the right. And so what do we do with that? Well, I don't know, right? Except for to ask that question of, is this yoga? And again, maybe sort of answer it on a case-by-case basis. Or maybe refuse to answer it at all. That's what I've got for you today. And let's sort of see if we can maybe dig a little bit deeper into this. Yeah? Thank you. I guess I can take my own questions, unless Shravana, you want to manage? Yes.
Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to
Yeah.
weigh in on is this yoga, because we've already established you're not going to do that.
I mean, I can offer you my personal opinion.
What I want to ask is what the scholarly conversation is about things like Christian yoga, or I've heard it called in Jewish circles Torah yoga. So actually using other spiritual traditions other than South Asian ones to or their spiritual goals of those traditions to put a framework on those yoga postures. So what's a scholarly conversation around that?
For sure. Well, and I think it kind of, it's very much a mirror of the types of concerns that I've tried to sort of lay out for us here today. Ultimately, I think it comes down to how those scholars understand religious traditions, right? And especially sort of religious practices, maybe, right? Our practices kind of automatically and inherently inscribed with, whatever the logic is of that tradition that it comes from. So when you're breathing a particular way, right, does that necessarily accomplish a certain kind of goal? Or are these more sort of like multi-purpose building blocks that you can pull apart, right, and then put them together however you want, right? So you can engage in the same practice, but then reframe it, right? Like okay, but I'm doing this for Jesus, right? And so therefore it's Christian and no longer, the rhetoric that you'll hear is kind of wild and often offensive, like you're not worshiping, the 80 million Hindu gods or whatever, which is of course what, the Southern Baptist Convention would immediately sort of shout back. So yoga studies is a small enough field that I think the conversation is still in its nascent stages to some extent. And so it's very easy to kind of, to view it as a lens onto these scholarly commitments about how we then, right? What is religion? How does religion kind of work? And so it's almost, if you wanted to sort of get a sense of what the back and forth is, I think it can be kind of distilled, I think, to these deeper, more theoretical, more disciplinary issues about how do we treat religious boundaries, right? Is there something that's kind of inherent to religious practices that bounds them within these traditions? Or are they transposable, right? And are they sort of context specific? And certainly I know people that would, sort of plant themselves on either side of that. I probably tend to be more on the latter side. I think that things are transposable and context specific. But I don't know, that history kind of matters, right? Does that sort of answer your question? Yeah, amazing. Yeah, other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Regarding the Eastern model versus the Western model, it seems as though the Eastern model focuses more on the inner body, while the Western model, as you said, focuses on balancing and the outer body's different astrological connections. So I was just wondering, how did that juxtaposition came from an individualistic culture focusing on the outer self, while a collectivistic culture such as the Indian culture focusing on the inner self?
I'm not sure that I've ever really thought about it in those terms. And I'd have to think about this more, right? Because I think this distinction that you're setting up, I understand what you're saying, right? We're so individualistic in the modern West. And that's absolutely true. But I think that's as much sort of a modern thing as it is a Western thing, right? And so I don't know that if you kind of trace it back even a couple of centuries, that you would have seen the same kinds of, like our notion that the body is so bounded, right, that we see in the West today. So I think, I don't know that I've really ever seen this articulated in terms of a kind of more social understanding of the body, right? I think it's more how you sort of understand that energy to operate, right? Like, and this to some extent we're oversimplifying pretty grossly too when we talk about Indian traditions, right? This notion that like somehow the energy fundamentally rests within the body. And so we need to, from the inside out, kind of connect to those outside forces. There's certainly other models where the energy is understood to be kind of a more surrounding thing, right? That needs to be, especially within medical tradition, you sort of want to balance, right, the various kinds of, like what they're called the doshas. So I think once you sort of start branching out from like, okay, this is like physical yoga, right?
Yeah.
Things potentially get a lot more iffy in terms of trying to draw these types of distinctions that I'm trying to draw for us here. I think it more has to do with how these specific practices evolve, like on a very micro scale, right? Like, why is it that we wanna like use the physical movements of the body to stimulate the energy in this particular way, right? Like, where did that understanding of it resting deep within the body come from? And so if you kind of treat it as a self-contained system, it makes a lot of sense. Same thing in the Western context. There's certainly kind of more of the mystical side of things where you want to kind of shoot your energy out of the body, right? Because you want to like ascend to heaven or something. Whereas if you're still focused on the body, then you have this kind of drawn in and the balancing. So I think the question that you're asking is really interesting to entertain, but then like you are sort of wading into this like much messier, larger cultural context, if that sort of makes sense. But then yeah, I think these concerns about like yeah, how porous is the body, how connected is the body, right? Like how dependent is the body on outside forces, including social forces, probably becomes really, really relevant.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe a cool topic for like a paper or something. Sign you a paper. Yes, back there.
Your talk reconfirmed the idea of metaphysics and how there's just one source of intelligence that human consciousness is all reaching and trying to sort out. And it was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very
That the
welcome.
metaphysical ideas that are behind all human thoughts are soaring us to the spiritual.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's some common assumptions, I think, about how the universe is put together here, right? Yeah, absolutely. And some of that might be like my own lens too, right? I warned y'all, like yoga is in the eye of the beholder. Certainly some of this is in my eye, right? Like it's my brain organizing this. And I might be particularly sympathetic to that idea. So there's probably, again, there's something there. Yeah, other things?
So I know from some academic lenses, yoga is viewed as more of like a science. In some academic fields, it's viewed as like a way of life, and we're observing the cultural trends and the phenomena throughout history. But when it comes into metaphysical concepts, I'm curious as to how we could have a scientific approach, an empirical approach to metaphysical phenomenon. Because whenever we're fundamentally talking about science and empiricism, we're talking about what's observable and what's trackable. But the problem with metaphysical concepts is they're not quite observable because they're kind of metaphysical. I was wondering, how can we have a scientific approach to metaphysical concepts?
Well, let me kind of, because I think we need to come to like common terms a little bit, right? So let me ask you to clarify a little bit, like even just in terms of the type of stuff that we've been discussing here today, I guess where do you draw the line around a metaphysical concept? Like when does it become metaphysical, the way that you're defining it, rather than being
I would
more
define
empirical?
metaphysical as particular aspects of our reality that may not be bound by space and time.
Okay. So if we're talking about, I don't know, maybe the way that this is impacting consciousness or something like that.
Are you asking?
Yes, I'm asking. Yeah.
Could you repeat your question?
Are we maybe, would you draw that line when we're getting into dimensions of this practice in terms of how it's impacting consciousness, rather than maybe just like the processes of the body? Like would that consciousness level be more metaphysical in your mind rather than physical?
I would say both, mainly because I do think that if it is possible to gain an understanding of, I want to figure out how to phrase this because we're obviously getting into metaphysical concepts, so I have to be extremely precise with my language because this is a precise concept.
Yeah.
I do think that whenever we're reaching into ideas where you're able to assume a certain state of consciousness that is not bound by space and time. You're also able to perceive, I guess, a metaphysical reality that is also not bound by space and time. So I think it
Yeah.
coincides with both.
Yeah.
Like I can give a quick example. Like for example, quantitatively, we know that there is like a fourth dimension, and we do know that in order to perceive the fourth dimension, you would have to perceive time itself as a physical dimension, which is not possible. I think quantitatively, we know that there's about 10 dimensions, which means that we can only perceive 3, so we're blocked off to literally like 70% of reality. And so if you're able to breach into an aspect of consciousness not bound by space and time, I have a sneaking suspicion that you may be also be able to perceive past the barriers of time and death as well, right?
Yeah, or able to be able to experience that somehow at least, right?
Right, that's why I think from what I read of the autobiography of a yogi, it hinted, or it strongly hinted at that idea, right?
Yeah.
There's like a state of timelessness and deathlessness, so yeah, I guess that goes back to my question of how can we have a scientific approach to such a difficult metaphysical concept.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that, because again, like, it's like, they are such precise sort of distinctions, right, that I think it's helpful to at least, like, in the sense that we can here with our limited time, like, synchronize our terms a little bit. I mean, I think there's two ways of answering that question. There's the way of answering it in terms of how, like, that historically has been done, right, or how people have sort of attempted to link the physical and the empirical and the metaphysical, versus, like, you know, sort of talking maybe more constructively, right, if we're trying to figure out, okay, well, like, how can we do this, right, moving forward? I think those are slightly different answers. So I'll try to, like, maybe give you a little bit of both to the extent that I can. This idea that yoga is sort of scientific practice, I mean, that's a relatively recent claim. And you really begin to see that pop up around the time of Vivekananda. In fact, he's one of the major players in terms of sort of like starting that conversation. Yogananda and Autobiography of a Yogi definitely kind of picks up on it, right? Yogananda was really inspired by Vivekananda, actually. And saw himself being in competition with Vivekananda in a number of ways. And so there's a couple of things going on there. On the one hand, there are all these sort of like colonial motivations, right? Because we want to represent yoga as something that's maybe like actually even a superior spiritual / religious practice. Scientific means superior increasingly, beginning in the 19th century. So there's that kind of baggage to it, which I think we can't fully dismiss. On the other hand, throughout certainly the 20th century, there are all these efforts to sort of, kind of establish, like if we're talking about these traditional practices, that maybe are supposed to take us into, a different way of experiencing or perceiving the world, right? These states that are often associated with enlightenment of various kinds. Where maybe, we're supposed to at least be sort of subjectively experiencing something that's beyond time and space and like death. Then what does it look like to sort of empirically then demonstrate that this is happening, right? That it's happening within the body, that it's triggered by this specific physical kind of practice. And so what you find in some of these sort of early 20th, mid-20th century yoga publications are basically sort of very systematic efforts to kind of dissect, like, okay, what are the various bodily movements doing? What are the various breathing exercises doing on kind of a physiological level? And then, like, first of all, what is that doing in the body, right? How is that maybe acting on the brain and cognition to the extent that they sort of understand those mechanisms at the time? We still haven't figured that out, right? So, like, obviously anything that these folks are saying is very, very provisional. And then this is where, I think this is what you're pointing at, right? And this is where they have the hardest time making a jump, right? Because they're able to sort of at least theorize or speculate, like, okay, well, if the nervous system is doing this, the body is going to react in this particular way, and then it might change the way that your mind is kind of able to engage with reality and, ways X, Y, and Z. But then how do we actually make the leap, right, to these more metaphysical claims? Especially because the metaphysical claims are so robust, especially in the Indian traditions. where, you know, like the body is supposed to acquire this almost like kind of superhuman status potentially, where you are supposed to be able to kind of experience and perceive reality in these much more expansive ways. And so at least what I've found in that historical literature is that like there's always a little bit of a hiccup there, right? Like they're never quite sure how to make that leap from talking about the physical to talking about the metaphysical. It just kind of happens, right? It's like, well, if you do X, Y, and Z, right, then you're going to be able to experience the world in these particular ways. And to sort of then swing over to the more, you know, kind of like let's now ourselves speculate, right? Let's see if we can sort of construct something here. Yeah, I don't know how you bridge that gap, right? Let me lay my metaphysical cards on the table here. I'm very much a non-dualist. Like I think everything in the world is kind of one thing. And so to the extent, right, that the metaphysical exists, it is for being continuous with the physical. That's my position, right? I think that somebody with a different position would sort of answer this question in a different way. But because I hold that kind of like ontological, metaphysical position, my intuitive sense is that we should be able to, at least on an empirical level, kind of, right, like create that scaffolding for this is what it might look like, right, for these sort of metaphysical ideas or truths or whatever to be manifesting within the body. But I think to some extent, right, that requires such a fine-tuned knowledge of like the empirical aspects of what we're talking about, which I mean certainly at the beginning of the 19th century we were nowhere close to, and I don't think we're doing that much better today, right? We still don't really know how the brain works. And so I think theoretically what you might have to do, right, if you were to sort of treat yoga or to treat any physical practice as a science, is at least start with like a really well calibrated understanding of the science, right, of what it is that the body is doing. And then maybe begin to kind of build those links. But whether or not that's actually possible, right, I mean, I'm maybe optimistic but agnostic, let's call it. Does that sort of help answer your question? No, that was like a lot.
Kind of not really.
Okay,
Cause
tell me more.
For me, I have like the basic contention of like, throughout most major religions, the understanding of God itself is perceived as to be the truth of the universe. And through certain yogic practices, it seems that the experience, even throughout Christianity in the Old Testament, there are like Moses on the Mount, for example, in the burning bush, and there's the personal experience of actually being in direct contact with God, which is the incarnation of truth fundamentally.
Right. And like ultimate reality.
Right, but the experience in itself is a subjective experience,
right,
which is the problem. You're having an objective encounter with it in a subjective way, and so that's when we start to get entangled within like the duality of which we start to understand life. It's really hard for me to like try to pair both of those together. It's extremely difficult, and so that's why I just, you know, I'm curious as to how we can parse things out in a very, very specific and meticulous way to the point where it's able to be, you know, understood. Because there was a lot of strange things, like for example, from an academic perspective, the concept of Mahasamadhi is actually very, very strange. I'm sure you know what that is.
Yeah.
And so from the documented cases that we have of Mahasamadhi, it's if for anyone that just listening that doesn't know what Mahasamadhi is, essentially in Hinduism and in certain yogic practices, there is like there's a stage of enlightenment where an individual is able to voluntarily leave their body and their heart stops. And so we've seen this, for example, with Paramahansa Yogananda. We saw that with his master and the master before him. And so trying to bridge the gap between science and metaphysical concepts is something that I'm still trying to parse out.
Yeah,
because when it comes to things like that, I'm a bit of a loss.
Yeah. Well, and like, I mean, let me be clear. I don't think we're going to answer that question today, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
But I think where we can maybe at least provisionally leave it is that I think to some extent it's impossible, right? Because the way that we experience reality, certainly the way that science works, is built on this kind of like the subject-object distinction, right? Like the fact that our experience is always on some level going to be our experience. you can't sort of inscribe it into a formula, right, or track it on, you know, a cardiogram or something like that. You can, right, on one level, on that objective level, right? So to the extent that, yeah, Mahasamadhi might have these sort of physiological manifestations, again, that kind of the objective, the physical scaffolding, I think we can examine that, and then I think we're back to, as I said, we're just sort of looking to, you know, really get our, get the science right. But I think that just by virtue of how that fundamental distinction between like your experience, right, on the inside and the way that the world on the outside works, how that is put together, like you're just sort of dealing with different domains, right? And I think there's maybe sort of a bridge there that can be a bridge, but you'll never kind of smush the two sides together, right? There's always going to be kind of the both and. It's always separate domains of experience, even though they might be kind of representing one reality. So that's the best I got. Anything else?